One main takeaway would be the interest for the project, because the first question which came was how much does it cost to update the data set, and that's sort of indication of the interest for the project. Other thing I would say is, of course, I was a bit surprised by how expensive housing seemed to be in many countries. I'd expect it to be cheaper, but that might have something to do with how it's calculated. I mean, it's a bit the case of Poland, where it was expensive, but then most people lived in their own houses and didn't have a mortgage. But I think the expense was something which surprised me. The other thing I didn't surprise me, but I thought was important, was the talk of the cultural aspect, in the sense that in different countries you have a different approach to housing. In the country where I come from, home ownership is the sort of main thing. In other countries it would be rental. But I think those sort of cultural differences you shouldn't underestimate when conceiving housing policies. And the third thing I think would be important is that there's maybe sort of data and maps and information which also, I mean, this is at European level, but it might also be applied at national level, like a new ways of presenting housing markets, new methods. So I think that's also important.
In the Espon House4ALL project, we have gathered a huge set of data through web scraping methodologies, and we have been able, together with some income data, to shed light onto the affordability challenges across Europe. And one of the biggest matters, of course, is that we prove now that this is an urban phenomenon. Of course, there are affordability challenges for many citizens in Europe, but particularly there's a challenge in the urban areas, in the coastal areas, in the touristic areas. And I think the biggest asset of the project is that we are able to show the size of the problem with concrete numbers of what is currently as housing offer on the market. Also, because we have data that is up to date now, one of the biggest challenges, or one of the groups that is the most exposed to finding housing that is affordable, is the younger generation. And they usually also have the lowest salaries, but they are also the ones who are coming on the market now, where we have very high prices. So we were able to show, with the differences in income data, that the exposure to unaffordability is varying across age groups, and that those that are now getting on the market and look in the rental market have a substantial entry barrier. Then maybe one more aspect that we looked into in the Espon House4ALL project, we of course did a big data exercise in trying to compare house prices and affordability across Europe. But a really important second step is also that we try to get a better understanding of what constitutes housing policies, what are the different policy fields that altogether impact house prices. And that ranges from environmental policies, energy policies, renovation, one of those, land use planning, monetary and fiscal policies, welfare, social policies, and understanding of how all these different puzzle pieces together form a market is really crucial. And of course, now that we have an overview of those, the next step in the project is also to look into the very place-based local specificities and understanding what policy instrument fits in which legal setting. From a European perspective, I think one of the main challenges right now is that we know there's an affordability crisis in Europe. Housing is a topic that's discussed everywhere. The European Housing Task Force has been implemented. And of course, that's where we need to understand localized, regionally different challenges of the housing market. Not just the prices, we can show this now with the data that we've provided, but also understanding what the legal context is. Because ultimately, if the European Commission, the European Union, the European Parliament more generally is developing, for example, financial instruments to combat the affordability crises, then you need to understand how these different policies transpose into the national legal settings. And we hope that our information can help analyze policy instruments in that direction.
For me, it's especially interesting to come to Brussels. This is a place now where we try to have an impact for the new Commission task force and the new unit in housing. It's very interesting that Espon also from Luxembourg come to Brussels to be more on the Commission side, to see what they're capable to produce and to develop as studies and to bring this now more on the political or administrative side for the decision makers, because here we need also to be aware that we want to produce something that we can use for the decision making. This study that we see this morning, it's from ESPON. It's very, very interesting also to bring new studies and new data. We know Eurostat, but now we wouldn't know ESPON.
The study highlights three main takeaways. The first one is that housing issues are very different across the EU, and it's something that we know anecdotally, but through a very analytical work. The second takeaway is that the policy contexts are also very different across the EU. Some countries have more developed legislation and institutions and a longer tradition of providing social and affordable housing. Other countries have an evolving system. And to solve the issues, the housing issues in the EU, I think the local context and the local knowledge will be key. The third takeaway is that monitoring and analyzing house prices across the EU is a complex and challenging task. So you need expertise, you need knowledge, but also determination and new data methodology to scrap, to find this data on the internet. And I think the ESPON study managed to do this in a very comprehensive way.
Housing Europe works to reinforce the voice of local, limited profit, social and cooperative and affordable housing providers at local level. So we are constantly looking for concrete policy recommendations to work better together with European institutions. So today's session was very useful because, as we know, what is not measured is not managed. So a lot of the facts that we have been hearing from our local members, the problems around lack of affordable rental housing, the problems that new households and young people have to access affordable housing, whether that is for purchase or for rent, were reinforced by the work of the ESPON team. So this is extremely useful for us. They have reinforced a lot of the messages we are hearing from our members with concrete data. We work with Eurostat data a lot at European level. However, very often that gives us national averages, which of course are useful, but don't really show the picture of the reality people are facing in different parts, in different regions, whether that's coastal, urban, suburban, rural. So what ESPON has managed to do with the data scraping is give a clearer picture of what the problems people are facing around Europe, but in the different regions of Europe. And obviously that is only going to improve policy making. I think what was also very useful from the discussion is the fact that we have to consider as a fact of life the growth in rental housing as part of the housing stock. So many countries did not have rental housing traditionally as a part of their stock, but actually the evidence is showing that this is a new reality. And therefore we have to, I think this leads to the obvious conclusion that we have to make sure this rental housing is an affordable option and not an option that is compromising too much the capacity to spend, so not taking too much of the income of households away. So I think that was also extremely useful. We also were able to see more clearly data around trends in investment, trends in public investment. And I think what can be useful for us there is to see how does that link with EU policy? Were there EU policies which actually resulted in a shift or a change in investment at national level? And if yes, why was that the case? And how can we potentially reverse that? So we can look at, okay, what is the EU framework that encourages or disincentivizes investment in housing? And obviously our focus would be to see how can we look at EU regulation and see how can we incentivize investment in housing that is non-speculative. Because after all of these efforts, all of this mobilization is to impact the housing crisis. What is the housing crisis? It is the de-link between households' income and what they have to pay for housing. So I think the housing plan that we are working on has to look at ways we can bring down the price of housing closer to what people are actually able to pay. So any interventions we make, whether they are on the supply side, on the regulatory framework side, it should be about finding ways to make speculation, reduce speculation in the sector and have a critical mass of affordable housing so that actually we start to see a change in the reality of people's difficulties in the housing market.